You know, when a war breaks out, you'd expect the world to react with shock, with sorrow. But what if I told you that for some people, it's actually a reason to celebrate, a sign that a divine prophecy is finally coming true? In this explainer, we're going to unpack dispensationalism. That's the theological framework that connects ancient scripture to modern warfare. All right, let's just dive right in. And we're going to start by looking at some pretty startling reactions to the recent conflict involving the US, Israel, and Iran. Because for some folks, this wasn't just geopolitics, it was something way, way bigger. So you've got John Hagee here. He's a massively influential pastor. And he's framing this war not as some political catastrophe, but as a divinely scheduled event. He's basically saying, hey, this conflict, it's part of God's plan, and it's happening right on time, just like the Bible said it would. And get this view isn't just coming from the pews. We're hearing reports like this one from the Military Religious Freedom Foundation that this sentiment is being echoed within the U.S. military itself. We're talking about commanders expressing unrestricted euphoria because they believe they are literal players in the Book of Revelation. All of this, it just leads to a really profound and, frankly, unsettling question. What kind of belief system could possibly lead people to welcome a war, with all its suffering and destruction, and see it instead as a positive thing, something to be celebrated? Well, the answer comes down to a relatively new and incredibly influential theological framework. It's called dispensationalism, and it's the specific lens that makes people see these events in this very particular way. Okay, so at its most basic level, it's a specific method for reading the Bible. The central idea is that God has sort of managed the world differently throughout history in these distinct stages or dispensations. You can almost think of it like different sets of rules for different eras of time. Now, what's really fascinating here is just how modern this whole framework is. You might think it's some ancient interpretation, but nope. It was actually developed in the 1820s by John Nelson Darby, and then it just exploded in popularity in America after the Scofield Reference Bible came out in 1909. And this right here, this is the roadmap that Scofield laid out. He basically broke down all of history into these 7 periods, each with its own unique way that God dealt with humanity. And according to this view, we are right now in number 6, the Age of Grace, or the Church Age. So these are the core beliefs that really drive the whole system. But for what we're talking about today, the 2 you really need to lock in on are the first 2. This idea that God has a completely separate plan for the nation of Israel versus the Christian church, and this insistence that all biblical prophecy has to be interpreted literally. Okay, so that brings us to that first point. Because this sharp division between Israel and the church, it's the absolute cornerstone of this entire way of thinking. And it's a huge break from traditional Christian thought. And this slide just lays out the difference perfectly. For most of Christian history, the church was seen as the new Israel, or spiritual Israel, one single unified group of believers. Dispensationalism says, no, that's completely wrong. It argues for 2 distinct peoples with 2 totally different destinies, an earthly one for Israel and a heavenly one for the church. This then leads to another really unique idea, that our entire era, the last 2,000 years, the church age, is just a temporary interruption. It's like a parenthesis in history, a pause in God's real plan, which is all about national Israel, and, they believe, has yet to be finished. So, the crucial point is this. According to a key theologian in this movement, Charles Ryrie, all those promises in the Old Testament made to Israel about land and restoring their nation, well, they have to be fulfilled literally by ethnic Israel sometime in the future. The church, he says, has absolutely nothing to do with them. So as you can probably imagine, a belief system that puts the modern nation of Israel at the absolute center of God's plan for the future, yeah, that has massive real-world political implications. And this is where theology crashes right into modern Christian Zionism. Now, to be clear, the movement of Christian Zionism is actually older than dispensationalism. But this theological framework gives it its most powerful and popular justification today. It provides a divine mandate, really, for political support of the state of Israel. You can see how the logic just flows directly from the theology. If you believe God's promises to Israel are literal and haven't happened yet, and that Israel coming back is key to the end times, well, then supporting the modern state of Israel becomes a theological duty. It's a way to help God's plan move forward. And boom. This is how a modern geopolitical conflict gets completely reframed. A country like Iran isn't just a political adversary anymore. It gets identified with a prophesied biblical enemy, like Persia in the book of Ezekiel. Suddenly, confrontation isn't just foreign policy, it's prophecy. So let's bring all this together and really look at the number one concern that gets raised about these very real-world implications. The danger that gets pointed out here is a profound theological twist. It's what happens when war, violence, and human suffering are no longer seen as tragedies to be avoided or mourned, but as positive, necessary, and even welcome signs that God's prophetic clock is ticking down. I mean, this prayer from Hagee's sermon, it just says it all, doesn't it? The conflict isn't framed as a human-led war with tragic consequences. It's seen as a divine battle, where you can actively pray for God to destroy the enemies right before your eyes. Ultimately, what this all shows is that the framework we use, the lens we look through to interpret world events, can fundamentally change our reality. It has the power to turn a human tragedy into a divine triumph, and to transform the horrors of war into a celebrated sign of hope. The lens you use, it can change everything.